The boardroom was an aquarium of power, the air thick with the tension of millions of dollars at stake. In the center, a man in an impeccable suit, Mr. Stephen Price, held a sheet of paper like a scepter, his face marked by a habitual superiority. He was a businessman, known as much for his fortune as for his arrogance, a man who measured people's worth by their bank statements. Standing before him, with a straight back and a steady gaze, was Louisa, a member of the janitorial staff who, for years, had moved through those halls like a silent shadow. To Mr. Price, she was just part of the furniture, an invisible figure he now decided to use as a pawn in his theater of power. With a mocking smile, he held up the document, issuing his challenge for all the executives present to hear. "Translate this into English, right now." The cruel proposal came next, a poison disguised as a bet. "If you get it right, I'll give you my day's salary, but if you fail, you'll be cleaning the restrooms. On this entire floor, by yourself, for a week." Uncomfortable, complicit laughter echoed through the room. The humiliation was a spectacle, and Mr. Price was the master of ceremonies. Louisa pressed her lips together but didn't move. Her eyes didn't waver. Inside her, a strength that no one in that room knew of began to stir, a dignity forged in battles those men in suits could never imagine. Mr. Price savored every second of that power play. He knew the document was a complex contract, written in legal English by his lawyers, a labyrinth of clauses and technical terms. The trap was perfect. He didn't expect Louisa, the woman who dusted his desk, to know more than the names of cleaning products. "Come on, what's the matter? Too difficult for a cleaning lady?" he insisted, delighting in the discomfort of the other employees, who exchanged embarrassed glances at the back of the room. He wanted an audience for his cruelty, to reaffirm the hierarchy that governed his universe. For him, this wasn't a test. It was a public execution of the self-esteem of someone he considered inferior. The humiliation was served in front of everyone, but her answer could change the game. If you believe that true strength is revealed in moments of the greatest injustice, subscribe to the channel and like this video to witness what happens when power underestimates dignity. What no one in that room of glass and steel could possibly imagine was the universe that existed behind Louisa's simple uniform. Years earlier, she wasn't a shadow in the hallways, but a brilliant young woman, passionate about words and distant worlds. With immense sacrifice, she had earned a spot in a translation and interpretation degree program, a dream she built night after night, between books and part-time jobs. Her future seemed mapped out, a bridge she herself was building away from the life of hardship she knew. Languages were her passion, translation her art, the promise of a life where her mind, not her hands, would be her primary tool. She remembered the joy in her chest, a feeling that she was finally on the right path, a path that life, cruelly, would soon divert. The turning point came in the form of a diagnosis, a sentence passed upon the person she loved most in the world, her mother. The degenerative disease required full-time care, and the medical bills piled up like an avalanche. Without hesitation, Louisa made a choice that redefined her existence. She dropped out of college, put away her books, and traded her dream for the duty of love. Every cent she earned at her new job as a service worker was for her mother's comfort. The nights she once spent poring over complex texts were now dedicated to watching over the sleep of the one who gave her life. It was not a surrender. It was an act of silent nobility, a conscious trade of her future for her mother's present. And so, the promising translator became the invisible woman. By putting on the uniform, she also put on a cloak of social invisibility. To executives like Mr. Price, she was just part of the scenery, a function, not a person. They passed her in the hallways, talking about multi-million-dollar deals, without ever registering her presence. She cleaned up the messes they left behind, heard their arrogant laughter, witnessed their lives of power and excess, all from the shadows. But this invisibility gave her a unique perspective. She learned to observe, to understand the fragility behind the arrogance. She saw the fear in the eyes of the assistants, the loneliness in those of the directors. She knew the true nature of that ecosystem long before she was dragged into the center of the arena. The tension in the room was so thick you could cut it with a knife. The chief financial officer, a man who normally exuded confidence, tried to intervene, visibly embarrassed by the spectacle. "Stephen, that's enough. This isn't professional," he said in a low voice. But Mr. Price ignored him with a dismissive wave, as if swatting away an insect. His attention was entirely focused on his prey. He reveled in the power, in the public humiliation he was orchestrating. Raising his voice so everyone could hear, he continued his psychological torture. "If you can't do it, just admit it. No one here really expects someone like you to understand international contracts." The way he spat the words, "someone like you," was a venom, distilling all his prejudice and classism for a captive audience. This wasn't the first time. The senior staff already knew Mr. Price's sadism. He fed on the fear and submission of others. In everyone's memory was the image of the gardener, an elderly man, fired on the spot for not greeting the boss with the enthusiasm he felt he deserved. And there was the incident with the chef, a talented woman who was brought to tears in front of the entire team for mispronouncing the name of a French dish. For Stephen Price, respect was a commodity tied to financial status. Those who didn't earn enough simply weren't worthy of being treated as human. He was a tyrant in his small corporate kingdom, and everyone had learned to walk on eggshells. Inside, Louisa was boiling. It wasn't wounded pride that consumed her, but a deep, righteous anger against the man's arrogance, against the certainty with which he felt he had the right to belittle her. One of the younger secretaries, feeling sorry for her, discreetly approached and whispered, "Don't mind him, Louisa. He's always like this." But the words of comfort were lost in the air. Louisa didn't hear them. Her focus was locked on Mr. Price. She understood with cutting clarity that the document in his hand was irrelevant. This was a ritual of power, a sadistic game to reassert his dominance over the weak. And in that instant, looking into the eyes of her tormentor, she made a decision. She would no longer be a pawn in his game. Then, after a silence that seemed to last an eternity, Louisa moved. She took a single step forward, a movement that emanated a confidence that shocked the room. Without asking permission, she reached out and took the sheet of paper from Mr. Price's hands. The act of taking the document was so unexpected that he recoiled for a second, surprised. Recovering, he broke into a mocking smile, ready for the final laugh. "Well, well, surprise us then, prodigy of the mop and bucket," he jeered. But Louisa ignored him completely. Her eyes were already scanning the lines of the text with a speed and certainty that silenced the murmurs in the room. Something was changing. The audience felt it. The game had indeed begun. The silence that followed Louisa's action was different. It was no longer the silence of embarrassment or fear, but of the purest, most intense anticipation. The executives in the room, who moments before had been looking away, were now mesmerized. Forks and pens stopped mid-air. Side conversations died. All eyes were fixed on the unlikely figure in the center of the room. The cleaning woman, in her simple uniform, holding a document worth millions, reading it as if it were a grocery list. The CFO, who had earlier tried to intervene out of pity, now leaned forward, his expression transformed by intrigue. The humiliation planned by Mr. Price had unexpectedly turned into a moment of unbearable suspense. While the room held its breath, Mr. Price remained blinded by his own arrogance. He was the only one there who didn't notice the change in atmosphere. The only one still seeing the scene through the lens of his prejudice. For him, this was just the extension of his cruel joke. He leaned back in his chair, a smirk of superiority plastered on his face, waiting for the moment she would admit defeat. He even made a gesture of false concern, raising his eyebrows and asking in a taunting tone, "Everything all right there, sweetie? Need help with the big words?" The irony was palpable. The man who prided himself on his business acumen was incapable of reading the most obvious situation in front of him. It was at that moment that the coerced audience began to transform. The younger ones, who grew up in the digital age, sensed the viral potential of the moment. Discreetly, a few cell phones were positioned under the table, their cameras activated. They didn't know what would come next, but they knew they needed to record it. And then, at the very instant Mr. Price was preparing another insult, Louisa looked up from the paper. Her eyes met his, and time seemed to stop. In a clear voice that sounded surprisingly professional in that setting, she began to speak. "This contract stipulates that the company will cover 80% of the operational expenses during the first quarter." The translation was perfect, and the first sentence landed in the room like a silent bomb. The room remained in an absolute dense and heavy silence. Mr. Price's mocking smile had vanished, replaced by a mask of shock and shame that he couldn't disguise. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. One of the executives leaned over to his colleague and whispered in disbelief, "Did she really understand all of that?" The other just nodded, dumbfounded. At the center of it all, Louisa remained serene, as if the task she had just performed was the most trivial thing in the world. Her calmness in the face of the room's admiration and astonishment was even more impactful than her perfect translation. She didn't gloat, she didn't smile. She simply proved her worth. And with that, she shifted the axis of power in that universe. Mr. Price's ego, however, fought desperately not to drown. He needed an explanation, any explanation, other than the humiliating truth that he had been bested by the cleaning woman. He forced a laugh that sounded hollow and pathetic. "Oh, please, someone must have fed her the answer. You memorized the text, didn't you, sweetie?" he said, his voice no longer taunting, now laced with a hint of panic. He pointed a trembling finger at her. "Admit it, it's impossible for you to know English at that level." His attempt to discredit her was transparent, a pathetic effort to restore the order of his world, where people like Louisa stayed in their proper places. In a move of strategic genius, Louisa decided not to play his game. Arguing with him would be to validate his absurd accusation. Instead, she ignored him completely, as if he had ceased to exist. She turned to the CFO, the man who had tried, however timidly, to intervene. With impeccable professionalism, she asked, "Sir, would you like me to also summarize Clause 9, the one that deals with the contractual penalties in case of a breach?" The director, now completely fascinated, just nodded his head in a silent yes. And then, with surgical precision, Louisa dissected the complex clause, not just translating but interpreting the legal nuances. It was checkmate. There was no longer any room for doubt. The silence that followed was that of a final verdict. Mr. Price, pale, held the paper with a trembling hand. The room that had previously laughed at Louisa now stared at him with a mixture of contempt and pity. Before he could articulate another excuse, a woman stood up. It was the head of human resources, a respected figure in the company. Her gaze toward Mr. Price was cold and professional. "Mr. Price, I believe that's enough," she said, her firm voice echoing in the room. "This type of treatment is absolutely unacceptable and will not be repeated in this company." The seed of the turn had been planted. Louisa's humiliation was no longer an informal spectacle. It was becoming a corporate incident with real and unavoidable consequences. The humiliation has turned into triumph, but the battle isn't over yet. If you've ever felt underestimated and dreamed of the day your true worth would be revealed, share your story in the comments and subscribe to the channel to see justice served. Before Louisa could leave, Mr. Price, cornered by his own mediocrity, delivered the lowest blow, Unable to attack her intellect, he targeted her honor. With a contempt that shocked even his own allies, he spat the words, "You probably learned to speak like that by sleeping with some rich foreigner." The insult, vile and cowardly, landed in the room like a toxic gas bomb. The murmurs turned into exclamations of disgust. The CFO slammed his pen on the table. The offense was no longer about a contract or a bet. It was a dirty attack on a woman's dignity, an act that crossed every line of human decency. Louisa froze, the impact of those words hitting her with the force of a physical blow. The scandal was immediate. Several executives stood up in protest. "That was unacceptable, Stephen!" one of them shouted. The HR director, trying to protect Louisa, approached her. "Louisa, please, come with me. Let's get out of here." She tried to lead her to the door, away from the aggressor. But, in a gesture that defined her entire character, Louisa refused to move. With a gentle firmness, she pulled her arm away from the director's grasp. She would not be treated as a fragile victim to be rescued. She would not disappear. Instead, she took a step forward into the center of the room, and a heavy silence fell. Her eyes, now shining with an almost tragic dignity, swept across the room. She had something to say. "For years," she began, and her voice, though calm, carried the weight of a lifetime of invisibility. "I have been a ghost to all of you. I've cleaned the floors you walk on, served the coffee you drink, but I was never seen." She paused, looking directly at Mr. Price. "But today, sir, you made me visible by force. And since I'm here, I will not go back into the shadows without saying what needs to be said." No one dared to interrupt her. "I did not study to clean offices. I abandoned my dream of being a translator to care for my sick mother, a woman who died without knowing if I would ever get to study again." The raw, painful confession hung in the air, a silent testament to her sacrifice. She continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. "I put on this uniform to survive, to have a roof over my head, but never, not for a single moment, did I stop being who I am inside." Finally, she fixed her gaze on Mr. Price, but her words were for everyone in the room. "And if you, sir, think that I am worth less because of my job, or that my knowledge could only have come from a dishonorable place, then the problem was never with me." She let the sentence resonate. "The problem, Mr. Price, has always been and will always be with you." The revelation was complete. Louisa had not just proven herself to be more intelligent, she had proven herself to be infinitely greater. Louisa's speech resonated in the room like a silent thunder, leaving a trail of shame and admiration. It was then that the head of the legal department, a woman who had remained silent until that moment, stood up. With a calm that commanded respect, she addressed the other executives. "Louisa is absolutely right, and as head of this company's ethics committee, I demand that this act of discrimination and verbal harassment be formally brought before the board of directors." Her voice was firm. "We can no longer allow the culture of this company to be built on contempt. The change begins today." Several directors nodded, and Mr. Price realized his castle of power was crumbling brick by brick. He was no longer feared, he was just a problem to be solved. As Mr. Price felt the ground disappear beneath his feet, another woman, who had been observing from a corner of the room, approached Louisa. She was an important foreign investor, invited for a negotiation that morning. She touched Louisa's arm gently. "Your English is impeccable," she said, "and your strength of character is even more impressive." She then made an offer that would change Louisa's life forever. "I am expanding my operations in the region and am looking for a trustworthy interpreter for my team. If you're interested, the position is yours." Louisa looked at her, stunned, and in the woman's eyes she saw a sincerity she hadn't found in a long time. For the first time, someone saw her value, not her uniform. Louisa's dignity, however, was greater than her desperation for a new life. She thanked the investor and promised they would meet later. First, though, she turned back to the company directors, who now looked at her with a new respect. "I appreciate the opportunities," she said, her voice clear and firm, "but I don't want to be hired out of pity, and I don't want you to forget what happened here as soon as I walk out that door." She challenged them with her gaze. "If it weren't for this public humiliation, I would still be invisible to all of you. The change you're offering me now needs to be a real change for all the employees who, like me, are treated as if they don't exist." The CFO, visibly impacted, nodded solemnly. "You are absolutely right, Louisa. The doors of this company are open to you if you want to stay. In another department, with training, with a dignified career path, the choice is yours." At that moment, Mr. Price, seeing himself completely isolated, attempted a pathetic, clumsy apology. "Louisa, it wasn't my intention. It was just a joke, a mistake." His words sounded hollow, empty, the last gasp of a power that no longer existed. No one in the room paid him any attention. The man who once dominated the room, with his voice, was now just background noise, pathetic and irrelevant. His transformation into a social ghost was complete. Then, Louisa performed the final act of her liberation. She walked to the corner of the room where she had left her cleaning supplies. She took her work apron, the symbol of her job and her invisibility, but she didn't throw it on the floor in anger, nor did she rip it. With a deep respect for her own journey, she folded it carefully. She walked back to the immense boardroom table and placed the folded apron on the polished wood. "I am not ashamed of the work I've done here all these years," she said, her voice serene. "But I refuse to remain in a place where I must be humiliated for my worth to be noticed." It was her silent resignation, not from the job, but from the role of victim they tried to impose on her. With the apron folded on the table as a silent testament to her journey, Louisa turned and walked toward the door. And then, something extraordinary happened. As she moved, the executives, the powerful men and women who had previously ignored her, instinctively stepped aside, creating a corridor for her to pass. It was a spontaneous gesture, a wave of respect that formed in her wake. No one said a word, but the movement of their bodies was the highest form of reverence. At the door, the foreign investor waited for her with a smile and an outstretched hand, not in a gesture of charity, but of partnership. Louisa left that room, leaving behind a world she herself had transformed forever. The door closed, and in the boardroom, Mr. Stephen Price was finally alone. The silence was now filled with his own failure. The other executives began to talk among themselves in low voices, rearranging the agenda, deliberately ignoring him. He looked down at the document in his hand, the sheet of paper he had used as a weapon and which was now just a reminder of his defeat. He still didn't fully comprehend the magnitude of what he had lost. In his mind, it had been a power struggle. In reality, he had lost something far more valuable: his own dignity. The video of his fury and humiliation was already traveling from phone to phone, a digital stain that his fortune could never wash away. Weeks later, Louisa's life was different. She was now working alongside the investor, not just as an interpreter, but as a valued consultant. Her intelligence and her calm recognized as the powerful assets they always were. Mr. Price's company, in turn, underwent an unprecedented ethical overhaul. The story of Louisa the Translator became a corporate legend, a mandatory case study in training seminars on respect and organizational culture. Her solitary act of courage forced an entire company to look in the mirror. She didn't just get a new job, she found herself and inspired a change that would benefit countless people in the future. The story of Louisa was never about a cleaning lady who could speak English. It was about a brilliant woman who refused to be defined by her uniform or her circumstances. It is a powerful reminder that human value is often hidden behind social masks, and that arrogance is a blindness that prevents us from seeing the extraordinary potential that resides in others. Respect, on the other hand, is the lens that allows us to see true greatness. In the end, a person's worth is not measured by the height of their position, but by the depth of their character, a truth that no language needs to translate. Did this story inspire you? If you believe in the power of dignity and that a person's true worth goes beyond appearances, subscribe, like, and comment where you're watching from. We want to know if you also believe that heroes can emerge from the most unexpected places.